Hey everyone, welcome to our first podcast. I'm Jay Wu. I'm a third year kinesiology student at U of T.
My name is Michael. I'm also a third year kinesiology student at U of T right now, and I'm currently residing in Vancouver.
I'm Chloe Zill. I'm also a third year kinesiology student and I'm a competitive figure skater.
So today we're going to be having a conversation with Professor Prof Tamminen, who taught us sport and exercise psychology at U of T. We hope you guys enjoy.
Hi, Professor Tamminen. This is Chloe. And here there are my coworkers, Michaels and Javiers. We're so happy to have you today to discuss mental health issues in regards to sports as well as current pandemic situations. So Professor Tamminen, can you start by introducing yourself a little bit?
Sure, thank you. And thank you for having me on. I really appreciate the invitation. So my name is Prof Tamminen. I am an associate professor at the University of Toronto in the Faculty of Kinesiology and Physical Education. And so at U of T, I do research in the area of sports psychology. And so in that area, my research focuses on stress and coping and emotions and how athletes regulate their emotions. And then I also do research looking at youth sport and how parents and coaches influence young athletes' experiences. I also teach courses in sports psychology and stress and coping, as well as research methods. And I also am a registered psychotherapist qualifying. So I do clinical work with people related to issues such as depression and anxiety and perfectionism and burnout and a number of issues, both in sport settings and also outside of sport contexts.
Great.
Perfect. I guess we'll just jump right into it. For you, why do you believe that mental health and emotions is important in the sense of an athlete?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's so timely right now too. So, in terms of sport, if we think about it simply from a performance perspective, we know that negative emotions such as anxiety or fear, these can be really detrimental for performance. So having those kinds of negative emotions can be hard on ourselves when we're trying to perform well. Additionally, if we're experiencing a lot of stress and a lot of anxiety when we're in sports settings, like at practices or during games, it's just going to be a lot less enjoyable, and we're not really going to enjoy being there. And so when it comes to youth sport and dropout, that's a really big concern. So emotions are really important, because if we're not enjoying what we're doing and it's really stressful and we're experiencing a lot of anxiety and pressure, it's not something that people are generally going to keep doing. So I think it's important to understand what contributes to those emotions, like what is it that's causing those negative situations and that stress, and then figuring out ways that we can reduce it from happening in the first place, as well as finding ways for athletes to deal with those emotions and cope with stress in the case where it might not be something that we can remove. So for example, if athletes get really anxious prior to competitions and games, that's hard to remove from the context of sport. We have to compete in sport. So we try to look at ways that we can help athletes regulate their emotions in that case. In other cases, though, it could be that coaches are a source of stress or parents are a source of stress. So we might look at changing coach behaviors or athletes' interactions with their coaches, or trying to change parent behaviors so that that source of stress isn't there for athletes to have to deal with. Mm-hmm. In addition to that, we also know that high performance athletes can be quite susceptible to increased risk of depression and anxiety, eating disorders, and other mental health conditions. So I do think that it's important to look at mental health and mental illness in athletic populations in particular, because there is some research that suggests that it's an area where we might not assume that athletes are experiencing these issues, but they are. I can go into more detail about why that might be the case, but I think it's really an important population to study.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Moving on, we would like to know a little bit more about what are the different coping strategies and how do we determine which one is the best for us?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. And coping and emotion regulation is really complicated, because a lot of the things that we do to cope with stress and the things that we do to cope with stress effectively depend on the stressor that we're facing. It depends on whether we can control the stressor or not, whether our efforts are going to make any difference. and our ability to use the right strategy at the right time. So in learning to deal with stress, it can sometimes feel like a bit of a trial and error, where we might have to try out a lot of different strategies before we start finding the right ones to cope with stress. There are several different ways of thinking about coping strategies. One common approach is to separate coping strategies that are problem focused. So these are strategies that focus on dealing with the stressful situation itself. Trying to put in more effort or trying to develop a plan and use problem solving. Those are all problem focused coping strategies. And then another category of coping strategies are emotion focused. And so these include strategies like trying to regulate your emotions, trying to maybe reappraise the situation. So to try to see the bright side or put a positive spin on the situation to decrease the negative emotions that you're having. So those strategies might not be directly targeting the stressful situation itself, but they can be targeting the emotions that come up in the situation. And then another category of coping strategies could be considered just avoidance. So just removing yourself from the situation completely. And avoidance could, in some cases, be an effective coping strategy. So if we think about a sports situation where an athlete is really getting a lot of calls by the ref, confronting that or trying to use problem-focused coping might not be terribly effective in a game. In that immediate situation, it might be more effective to just disengage, avoid going up to the ref, like remove yourself from the situation, because if you were going to go and confront the ref, you might actually create a situation where you're getting more calls or you might get penalties. So the point here is that the type of strategy that's going to be most effective really depends on the situation and the stressful situation you're facing. In some cases, problem-focused coping works really well, especially if a stressor is controllable and we can actually make a plan and put more effort into it and execute some actions to deal with the stressor. That's great. Problem-focused coping should work. But if it's uncontrollable or there's nothing we can do about the situation, then it might be more effective to use emotion-focused coping. So to try to reappraise the situation, seek emotional support, talk to people, and to try to decrease our negative emotions in that situation. So the answer to your question is a bit complicated because there are a lot of different types of coping strategies, and the way that we figure out what's going to work best for us really depends on what we're trying to achieve in that situation and the situation that we're in.
Thank you. They've been really, really helpful.
So building off of that, during this pandemic, many individuals are experiencing a decrease in mental health and an increase in stress and anxiety. So our question is, why do you think this is happening? And what are some tips you would give to like the general public, not only athletes, but families out there to safely cope with this?
Sure. So the pandemic has really been a situation that's, created so much chaos, and it's just been an upheaval to all of our lives. It's completely changed the way that we interact, the way that we work, the way that we go to school, the people that we can see, the sports that we can play or not. So it's been this massive upheaval that creates a lot of disruption. People generally like structure in their lives and knowing, some predictability about things that are going to happen. And at the moment, the situation with the pandemic is so uncertain. There's a lot of uncertainty, and uncertainty is one of the defining features of what makes things stressful. If there's uncertainty, that can be quite challenging to face. So those are some of the things that might contribute to increases in negative emotions, but also it's creating a situation where some of the things that we used to do to cope with stress are no longer available to us. So a lot of people might exercise and play sports as a way of dealing with stress. And we know that exercise is so important for mental health. And when that's not possible, then, that's one of our main coping strategies. That's really hard to readjust and figure out, well, what else can I do to try to cope with stress? So we know that social interactions and maintaining a rich social life is really important for dealing with stress as well. And in the pandemic, we've lost a lot of those opportunities, and we have to be really creative about finding ways to create those opportunities to maintain those social interactions. So it's created a lot of challenges. It's also taken away a lot of the ways that we might normally have tried to cope with stress, or we might just do these things in our daily lives, and by doing them, they're contributing to positive mental health, and now we don't have the opportunity to do that. So I think if we're looking at trying to provide suggestions or advice about how to cope with this situation that we're in, we can think about, the general principles that we would use when we're trying to learn to cope in other situations. And I think one of the things that's really important is reflecting on our stressors and reflecting on what it is that's really impacting our lives. Like what are we missing the most? What's really hard about this for ourselves? And then thinking, well, what can I do to deal with that part of the stressful situation? So, there's some things that we can't control. We don't know when sports are going to go back to usual. That's very unpredictable. So can we adjust our training and our exercise so that we can still maintain physical activity and get some of those mental health benefits? If it's the social support piece that we're missing, could we find different ways of connecting with people? There's a lot of great opportunities through Zoom. There's a lot of great social media opportunities that we can embrace. We can also look at whether or not, we're developing any bad habits that are actually making our mental health worse. So, sometimes people get really caught up in Twitter or Instagram and doom scrolling and just kind of like looking at all of the bad news all the time. So reflecting on what we're doing and thinking about what we could do differently and do more productively could be quite helpful. So we need to think about and kind of develop a meta awareness about our own habits and to look and say, like, is this actually helping me? Is this approach to dealing with stress actually serving me? Or is this just making things worse? And then with that information, with that self-knowledge, then we can try to identify new strategies, new approaches to coping with stress. And I firmly believe that social support is so important. If we can get it somehow from our friends, our family, even if it's just checking in with somebody else, texting them, having a phone call, that human interaction is so important. So I think that that's a really key piece to maintain.
All right, thank you.
Since Professor Tamminen already covered, the emotions are very important, and then we should be focused on that and then at least be aware of it. And so do you guys have any other questions you wanted to address?
Yeah. So for athletes, like as the general population of athletes, can you share with us some of the findings that surrounds the effects of stress and stressors, such as any research findings or like any data relating to that?
Sure, yeah. And there's a lot of research in that area, so I'm sure I could go on for a long time talking about it, but I can summarize some of the main findings that we know, and I can also share a little bit about some of the research that I've done on this topic.
Right, for sure.
So as I mentioned earlier, there's a good body of literature and research that shows that generally negative emotions like feelings of anxiety or fear or pressure, those kinds of feelings can generally be bad for performance. Like if you're going into a situation and you're feeling really anxious, that tends to be associated with, butterflies in your stomach and a racing heart and sweaty palms. Sometimes athletes will get so nauseous that they're throwing up before competitions and games. It can be really hard to focus, or you don't know what to focus on. And so this can be really disruptive for performance. So we know that stress and negative emotions can be quite detrimental for performance. I will say, though, that there is some research that suggests that certain types of emotions can be almost like perceived as helpful for performance. So there has been some research with some athletes, for example, with rugby players. I believe there's been some research with football players that suggests that some emotions, such as the feeling of anger, can be viewed as helpful for performance. So some athletes feel that they actually want to get like amped up and get angry so that will help them perform. So I just want to be cautious about like making these broad statements that all negative emotions are bad for performance. That's not always the case. There are some times where some athletes find that like they perform best when they feel a little angry. And some athletes feel like if they're too confident and feeling too good, like too many pleasant emotions, that is actually bad for their performance. And we can sometimes see that athletes might go into a game like too confident and feeling really good about themselves, and they might underperform. So what's important here is that we can't just generalize to everybody. And it comes back to this principle of like understanding your own best place, your own zone for performing. Some athletes are going to perform really well with like a moderate level of anxiety, and some athletes can tolerate higher levels of anxiety. So athletes can kind of get a sense of like when they perform well and what emotions are going to be helpful for them in that performance. Some other research on stress and stressors suggests that when we're facing like situations that are stressful, not everyone's going to appraise the same thing as stressful. So what might be really stressful for one person might not be stressful for another person. And again, that it's hard to generalize to everybody and say like everybody's going to experience, you know, their first time at the championships as super stressful. That might not be the case. So it's a very individualized area where each person might see it as more or less stressful than the other. And so it comes back to this idea about like knowing yourself and that self-awareness about times when you perform well and what kinds of things you tend to find stressful, as opposed to times when you perform, you know, poorly. So then some other research that exists that kind of goes back to the point I was making about social interactions and social support is that there's some compelling research that suggests that perceptions of support from people around you, so if you feel that you're supported by your teammates, supported by your coach, tends to be associated with better what we call challenge appraisals in sport, where we might be going into a competition, but we actually feel kind of anxious, but like we're feeling good about it. We feel like we're fairly capable and we're going to do all right, as opposed to people who feel less support from their teammates, maybe less support from their coaches. That situation tends to be associated with what we call a threat appraisal, which is where we feel really threatened. It's almost like feeling like it's a dangerous situation, and it's feeling, you know, resulting in a lot of anxiety. So the perception of having social support around us, people might not even be actually doing much in that moment, but if we just feel like there's someone there around us who can support us, that's really important for improving the appraisals that people are going to make about competition. So I think the takeaway point from that is that the support that we provide to others and that people feel is available to them can have these downstream effects of improving their appraisals of competition and anxiety, and will, you know, sort of down the road, hopefully improve their performance as well, because they might not be having as much anxiety in that situation. I'll just add a little point to kind of talk a little bit about some of my own research on this topic. We're doing some research now where we're looking at the ways that athletes influence one another's emotions. So in the past, researchers have really tended to focus on asking each athlete, like, what do you find stressful? How do you deal with it? How are you coping? How are you regulating your emotions? And what's the impact on your performance? Recently, in some of the work that I've been doing, I'm really interested in looking at how athletes might try to influence their teammates' emotions, or how coaches try to regulate their athletes' emotions. Because we know that, you know, there's like sort of like an emotional climate within a team sometimes. And athletes might try to make one another feel better. Like if we're not performing well, there might be people who are like, it's all right, it's okay, we got this one, we got the next one, you're doing all right, don't worry about it. But in some cases on teams, there might be athletes who go the other direction, and they might try to make their teammates feel worse about the things that they are doing wrong or their bad performances. And we are interested in looking at how that impacts performance. So, you know, I think we could make an assumption that improving other people's emotions is probably a good thing, but we do see a lot of instances where athletes might try to like make other people feel bad, or we might see that happening from coaches or parents, or, you know, there's some of these cases where people might be trying to worsen the emotions of athletes. And so we're interested in understanding how those interpersonal processes of emotion and emotion regulation work. And so some of our research that we've published on that topic so far suggests that in the days leading up to competition, so like in the 3 or 4 days before a game, athletes who perceive like more emotion worsening, so if they feel like everybody on the team is kind of not being very nice to each other and they're kind of getting on each other's cases and making each other feel bad about themselves, that is associated with a greater likelihood of a team losing in competition that weekend. So it's kind of like the pattern of emotion regulation between the teammates leading into competition can actually predict whether or not the team's going to win or lose that weekend. And I think that kind of makes sense, right? I think if we've got, you know, a group of people who are really hard on one another and, you know, maybe practices weren't going well or the team dynamics just don't feel great, I think it's probably going to be harder to win in those situations. It's going to be really difficult. So, so those are some of the things that we're interested in looking at, not just how do you cope individually as an athlete, but how are your emotions affected by your teammates? And how do you impact your teammates' emotions? Like, are you contributing positively to the team, or are you making the, you know, the rest of the team feel bad and therefore negatively impacting performance?
Thank you so
That's
much.
really interesting.
We understand that you're on a very busy schedule right now, so we won't keep you here any longer. But we appreciate you for being here. I'm sure I say on everybody's behalf. just saying for everybody here, I hope that what Professor Tamminen has told us here today is helpful in fostering a better understanding of your mental health and your emotions. And hopefully you can use this to develop as athletes in the future and just as better individuals, just to understand your emotions better. So thank you so much once again, Professor Tamminen. And yeah, if anyone else has anything else to say, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for your time, Professor Tamminen, and they're all great answers. They've been really helpful.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And yeah, good luck in the future.